The wind howled across the fenlands of Lincolnshire, carrying with it the biting frost of a cruel winter. It was Christmas morning, 1642, yet there was little cause for celebration in the stone manor of Woolsthorpe. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke, and a silence hung over the house, heavy and expectant. In a small, draughty room, a child was born, a boy, so small, so impossibly fragile, that the midwives whispered he would not see the sunset. He was a delicate thing, pale and translucent as spun glass. His mother, Hannah, looked down at the tiny form, trembling, not with joy, but with a terrified awe. She would later say that he was so diminutive he could have fit comfortably inside a quart mug, a ceramic vessel meant for ale, not for the housing of a human soul. This was Isaac Newton. He entered the world fatherless, his namesake having perished 3 months prior, leaving the infant to inherit nothing but a name and a vast, encroaching silence. The boy did not die that day. He clung to life with a stubborn, quiet ferocity that would come to define his entire existence. But the trauma of his survival was merely the prologue to a deeper, more severing wound. When Isaac was 3 years old, the few threads of security he possessed were violently cut. His mother, young and burdened by the management of the estate, accepted a proposal of marriage from a wealthy clergyman named Barnabas Smith. He was a man of the church, twice her age, who desired a wife but had no patience for a stepson. The arrangement was cold and absolute. Hannah would move to the rectory in a neighbouring village to live with her new husband, and Isaac would remain behind at Woolsthorpe, left in the care of his grandmother. One can imagine the small boy standing at the window, his hand pressed against the cold pane, watching the carriage take his mother away. He did not cry out, he merely watched, his dark eyes recording the betrayal with the precision of a scientist noting a catastrophic variable. For 9 long years he lived as a virtual orphan in his own home. He became a ghost in the manor, wandering the empty corridors and the tangled gardens, learning to prefer the company of his own thoughts to the unreliable nature of human affection. This abandonment planted a seed of dark, roiling fury deep within his chest. It was a rage he could not speak, for he was a quiet, stuttering child, prone to introspection. Instead, he let the anger simmer, distilling it into a potent poison. Years later, in a moment of terrifying vulnerability, a 19-year-old Isaac would take a quill to parchment and list the sins of his youth. Amidst the mundane confessions of a teenager, one line stood out, written in steady, unforgiving ink, threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. The image is chilling the lonely genius, envisioning the purifying flames consuming the family that had cast him aside. He was not merely a sad child. He was a volatile chemical compound, stable only until shaken. He sought refuge in mechanics and motion. While other children played, Isaac built. He constructed intricate windmills powered by mice, water clocks that dripped away the lonely hours, and paper lanterns that he attached to kites, flying them at night, to terrify the local villagers into thinking comets were descending upon the earth. He was learning that he could manipulate the world, that he could control the unseen forces of wind and water, even if he could not control the people who were supposed to love him. At the King's School in Grantham, he was initially an unremarkable student, his mind too occupied with the grinding gears of his own inventions to care for Latin grammar. He was a glass child, easily overlooked, seemingly brittle. This changed on the day that would echo through the history of science, though it began with a simple act of cruelty. A school bully, sensing Isaac's strangeness, kicked him hard in the stomach. The pain was sharp, but the humiliation was worse. Something within the quiet boy snapped. He challenged his tormentor to a fight in the churchyard after school. It was an absurd mismatch. Isaac was small and slight, his opponent larger and stronger. But Isaac fought with a desperate manic energy, a release of years of stalled resentment. He pinned the boy against the church wall, rubbing his nose against the rough stone until the bully yielded. Victory in the flesh was not enough for Isaac. He needed to dismantle his enemy completely. He realized that the ultimate dominance was not physical, but intellectual. He returned to his books with a ravenous hunger, climbing the rankings of the school until he stood alone at the top. He had learned a vital lesson. The mind is a weapon, sharper than any blade, capable of crushing those who doubt you. He carried this lesson to Cambridge, and then, inevitably, back to the solitude of Woolsthorpe. In 1665, the Great Plague swept across England like a dark tide. The universities closed their gates, the cities emptied, and the world fell silent. Isaac, now a young man, returned to the isolated farmhouse of his birth. For 2 years, while death stalked the country, he entered a state of magnificent isolation. Here, in the quiet orchard, where the only sound was the rustling of leaves, the glass child became the architect of the universe. He sat for hours, days, staring at the interplay of light and shadow. The legend tells of a falling apple, but the truth was far more internal. He was not merely observing gravity, he was feeling the weight of the cosmos. He wondered if the same invisible hand that pulled the fruit to the grass also reached out to grip the moon, holding it in its celestial tether. His curiosity was not gentle. It was masochistic. He needed to know the nature of reality, no matter the cost to his own body. In his study, obsessed with the nature of light and colour, he took a bodkin, a long, blunt needle used for sewing leather, and held it up to his face. With a steady hand, he slipped the needle between his own eye and the bone of the socket, pressing it deep toward the back of his eye to alter the curvature of the retina. He moved the needle, pressing and prodding his own optic nerve, documenting the white, dark and coloured circles that bloomed in his vision like phantom fireworks. He was blinding himself, risking permanent darkness, just to see how the light worked. It was a grotesque, beautiful act of devotion. To Isaac, the body was merely a tool, a vessel to be used and broken in the service of the mind. He discovered that white light was not pure, as Aristotle had claimed, but a composite of all colours, a hidden rainbow locked inside the visible world. He darkened his room, drilling a tiny hole in the shutter to allow a single beam of sunlight to pass through a prism, painting the wall with the spectrum. He was dissecting the divine light of God, breaking it apart to understand its machinery. Yet for all his brilliance, he was profoundly alone. The trauma of his youth had calcified into a deep paranoid secrecy. He hoarded his discoveries like a dragon guarding gold. He wrote millions of words that no one would see for centuries, filling notebooks not just with calculus and optics, but with the raving, obsessive scrawls of a man searching for ancient magic. He was not the first of the Age of Reason, as the world would later claim. He was the last of the magicians. He believed that the universe was a cryptogram set by the Almighty, and he was the only one clever enough to solve it. This arrogance was his armor. He began to delve into alchemy, the forbidden chemistry of transmutation. In the flickering candlelight of his laboratory, surrounded by furnaces and bubbling crucibles, he inhaled the toxic fumes of mercury and lead. He was chasing the Prisca Sapientia, the pristine wisdom of the ancients, believing that the floor plan of Solomon's temple held the mathematical key to the apocalypse. The mercury he inhaled settled in his hair and in his brain, a slow-acting poison that would eventually fracture his fragile psyche. He slept little, ate less, and forgot to bathe, his mind spinning at a velocity that defied the very laws of motion he had discovered. He was building a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, convinced that gravity was the will of God acting upon matter. As the plague years ended and he prepared to return to the world of men, he was no longer the boy who had watched his mother leave. He was a formidable, terrifying intellect, possessing secrets that could rewrite the understanding of existence. But the shadows of Woolsthorpe clung to him. He carried the silence of the manor in his heart, a cold, impenetrable void that no amount of praise or acclaim could fill. He was a man made of glass, hard, brilliant, and capable of cutting anyone who tried to get too close. The fire he had once wished upon his parents' house now burned inside his own mind, a relentless, consuming flame that drove him toward the edges of sanity, where the line between genius and madness began to blur into the grey mists of the unknown. The stone walls of Trinity College, Cambridge, offered a silence that rivaled the isolation of Woolsthorpe. But within Isaac Newton's chambers, the air hummed with a tension that was almost electric. He had returned from the plague years, not merely as a scholar, but as a man possessed by a singular, terrifying drive to undress the universe and expose its naked machinery. To the students and fellows who saw him hurrying across the great court, his gown billowing like a dark cloud, he was a phantom aloof, distracted, his eyes fixed on a horizon that no one else could see. He lectured to empty rooms, his voice murmuring complex geometric truths to dust motes and wooden benches, for few could comprehend the labyrinthine corridors of his mind. But it was in the solitude of his private study, behind heavy oak doors, that the true extent of his obsession revealed itself. He was a man willing to violate the sanctity of his own flesh in the pursuit of knowledge, to understand the nature of light and colour, to prove that white light was not pure, but a mixture of all colours. He undertook experiments that would have made lesser men recoil. He took a bodkin, a blunt needle used for sewing leather, and wedged it between his own eye and the bone of the socket. He pressed it down deeper and deeper, deforming the curvature of his eyeball until he saw white, dark, and coloured circles manifest in his vision. He probed the limits of perception with a cold clinical detachment, treating his own body as just another apparatus in the grand experiment. This was the nature of his genius, a fearless, almost masochistic precision that acknowledged no boundary between the observer and the observed. Yet the physics of light and gravity were only the surface of his inquiries. As night fell over Cambridge and the other dons slept, Newton shed the robes of the mathematician and donned the apron of the alchemist. He was not, as history would later paint him, the first king of reason, but rather the last of the magicians. In the flickering orange glow of a coal furnace, he spent endless hours tending to crucibles of molten metal, inhaling the acrid, sweet fumes of sulphur and mercury. He was searching for the Prisca Sapientia, the ancient wisdom he believed had been known to the patriarchs and lost to the ravages of time. He wrote millions of words, not on calculus, but on the transmutation of lead, the philosopher's stone, and the hidden chronologies of the Bible. He believed the floor plan of Solomon's temple held the mathematical key to the cosmos, a divine blueprint encoded in cubits and cedar. He pored over the book of Daniel, calculating the rise and fall of empires, eventually concluding that the apocalypse, the final fiery end of the world, would not come before the year 2060. This was a man who held the universe in one hand and the Bible in the other, convinced they were two chapters of the same book, written by the same author. But to read that book, he had to delve into heresies that would have seen him stripped of his position. Or worse, he secretly rejected the Trinity, viewing it as a corruption of the true faith, a perilous secret he guarded with the same ferocity he applied to his work on gravity. This obsession with secrecy was not merely a professional precaution. It was the scar tissue of a childhood defined by abandonment. The trauma of his early years in Lincolnshire had calcified around his heart. He remembered, with crystal clarity, the day his mother, Hannah, had left him. He was 3 years old, a small, fragile thing who had barely survived his premature birth. Small enough, she had said, to fit in a quart mug. She had married a wealthy clergyman, Barnabas Smith, a man who had no use for a stepson. And so she had gone to live in a rectory, a mile away, leaving Isaac behind with his grandmother. That mile might as well have been an ocean. For 9 years he watched the road, a fatherless boy rejected by the only parent he had left. The resentment brewed in him like a poison. It manifested in a dark, quiet rage that he catalogued in a notebook at age 19, a list of 57 sins he had committed. Amidst the mundane confessions of stealing cherries or eating an apple in church, there lay a line of chilling, homicidal fury, threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. The image of the burning house was the primal scream of his psyche. He had wanted to destroy the world that had rejected him, to purify the pain with fire. Now, as a man, that fire was internalized. He did not burn houses, he burned with an intellectual fever that consumed everything it touched. This psychological fragility made him brittle as glass. He could not bear contradiction. When Robert Hooke, a brilliant but envious rival, dared to critique his theories on optics, Newton recoiled with a violence that was disproportionate and lasting. He withdrew from the Royal Society, retreating into his shell like a wounded animal, hoarding his discoveries for years rather than risk the sting of criticism. He viewed intellectual theft as a personal assault, engaging in a lifelong, bitter war with the German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz over the invention of calculus. It was a feud by Newton's desperate need to be the sole possessor of truth, the only son chosen by God to decipher the code of creation. But the fire he played with, both metaphorically and literally, eventually burned too hot. By 1693, the accumulation of stress, the decades of crushing intellectual labor, and the toxic vapors of the alchemical mercury he inhaled nightly began to erode the foundations of his mind. He had been working with quicksilver, tasting it, heating it, letting it seep into his pores. The heavy metal ravaged his nervous system, triggering a collapse that was total and terrifying. The black year descended upon him. He went 5 nights without a wink of sleep, his mind racing like a carriage with no driver. The barrier between reality and his internal anxieties dissolved. He began to suspect his closest friends of conspiring against him. He wrote wild, erratic letters to John Locke and Samuel Pepys, accusing them of trying to embroil him with women and wishing for his death. The paranoia was thick and suffocating. The breakup of his intense, perhaps romantic friendship with the young Swiss mathematician Nicolas Fatio-Dedoullier severed his last emotional anchor. Newton was adrift in a sea of mercury-induced madness, the brilliant order of his universe collapsing into chaos. The burning house he had once imagined was now his own mind, the flames licking at the edges of his sanity. Yet the iron will that had birthed the Principia would not let him perish in the ashes. He emerged from the breakdown changed harder, colder, and finished with the solitary life of the academic. The cloisters of Cambridge had become a prison of bad memories. He needed a new theatre, a place where his craving for order could be imposed upon the chaotic world of men. In 1696, he accepted the post of Warden of the Royal Mint and moved to London. Most men treated the wardenship as a sinecure, a comfortable retirement for aging gentlefolk. Newton treated it as a command. The currency of England was in crisis, clipped and counterfeited to the point of collapse. Newton applied the same ruthless rigorousness to the coinage that he had applied to the cosmos. He became a detective, a creature of the London fog. He shed his velvet robes for disguises, venturing into the gin-soaked taverns and squalid dens of the criminal underworld to gather intelligence. He was hunting treason. His nemesis was William Challoner, a master forger with a genius that rivaled Newton's own, albeit turned toward deception. Challoner mocked the law, confident in his ability to outwit the authorities, but he had never faced a mind like Newton's. The physicist constructed a net of evidence with mathematical precision, cross-examining witnesses, turning accomplices, and closing every avenue of escape. He pursued Challoner not with the passion of a man seeking justice, but with the cold inevitability of gravity itself. There was no mercy in him. When Challoner was finally dragged to the gallows at Tyburn to be hanged and disemboweled, Newton was not present to jeer. He was in his office, documenting the outcome. The equation balanced, the error corrected. In London, surrounded by the machinery of the state and the adoration of a society that barely understood him, Newton solidified his legend. He became president of the Royal Society, ruling over British science with an autocratic grip. He used his power to scrub the names of his rivals from the history books, ensuring that his light would shine alone. But beneath the wig and the titles, the silence of Woolsthorpe remained. He sat in his library, surrounded by 1,600 books, their pages dog-eared aggressively to point like arrows at the truths he hunted. He was still the boy alone on the farm, watching the road, building a fortress of knowledge so high that no one could ever hurt him again. The fire of his youth had been tamed into a cold, hard diamond, brilliant and impenetrable, casting a long, sharp shadow that stretched toward the future. The fire of his youth had been tamed into a cold, hard diamond, brilliant and impenetrable, casting a long, sharp shadow that stretched toward the future. Yet, to understand the solidity of the stone, one must understand the immense pressure that formed it, the crushing weight of a world that had tried to extinguish him. Before he had even drawn his first breath, the man who sat in the high chair of the Royal Society, wearing the heavy wig of authority, was merely the shell that protected the terrified, furious boy within. His story did not begin with triumph, but with a fragility so profound it seemed a miracle he survived the first night. Isaac Newton was born on Christmas morning in the hamlet of Woolsthorpe, a tiny, premature scrap of life entering a world already darkened by loss. His father, an uneducated human also named Isaac, had been in the cold earth of the churchyard for 3 months before the son's eyes opened. The infant was so small, so impossibly delicate, that his mother, Hannah, would later whisper that he could have fit entirely inside a quart mug. He was a thing of fragile bones and pale skin, teetering on the edge of existence, held to the earth only by the sheer, stubborn will of a mother who had already lost her husband. But the true coldness entered his heart not at his birth but 3 years later. It was a coldness born of betrayal. His mother, young and overwhelmed, accepted a proposal of marriage from a wealthy, aging clergyman named Barnabas Smith. But the clergyman wanted a wife, not a stepson, and so a bargain was struck, a transaction of the heart that would scar the boy for eternity. Hannah moved to the neighbouring village to live with her new husband, leaving 3-year-old Isaac behind at Woolsthorpe Manor in the care of his grandmother. He stood at the window, a small, solitary figure, watching the road where she had vanished. He was an orphan with a living mother. The psychological wound was absolute. He did not merely miss her, he raged against the abandonment with a ferocity that simmered beneath his quiet exterior. Decades later, when the world saw only the pious scholar, Newton's private journals would reveal the magma of his resentment. In a list of sins composed in his youth, written in a shorthand that kept his secrets safe from prying eyes, he confessed to a thought that stopped the blood, threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. The genius who would later define the laws of cooling bodies was forged in this furnace of abandoned heat. He learned then that he could rely on no one. People were variables that could not be calculated. They were erratic, cruel, and prone to leaving. Only the physical world, the stone, the light, the math remained constant. This isolation followed him to the King's School in Grantham. He was a strange child, dreamy and detached, his mind wandering in mechanical inventions while his classmates played. He built windmills powered by mice and water clocks that dripped the seconds away, constructing a world where he had total control. But the boys of Grantham were not machines, and they sensed his difference. He was ranked near the bottom of his class, a silent target. The turning point came not in a classroom, but in the churchyard. A school bully, stronger and older, kicked Newton hard in the stomach. It was a physical violation that triggered something dormant in the boy's spirit. He did not cower. He challenged the boy to a fight. There, in the shadow of the church, the frail boy who fit in a quart mug fought with a desperate, manic energy, beating his tormentor until he rubbed the boy's nose against the church wall. It was a victory, but for Newton, physical dominance was not enough. He needed to destroy his enemy completely. He decided he would surpass the bully in the only arena that truly mattered, the mind. He began to study with a terrifying intensity, climbing the ranks of the school until he stood alone at the top. He had learned that intellect was a weapon, a way to build a wall so high that the chaotic world could never kick him again. This solitary drive culminated in the years of the Great Plague. When Cambridge University shuttered its doors against the Black Death, Newton returned to the silence of Woolsthorpe. These were the miracle years, though they passed in a quiet so deep it felt like a trance. While the world died in the cities, Newton sat in the orchard, the air heavy with the scent of ripening fruit. It was here, in this magnificent isolation, that the universe began to whisper to him. He was 23 years old. He did not just observe the world, he interrogated it. He sought to understand the nature of light, not by reading the ancients, but by touching the fabric of reality itself. In a darkened room, he bored a hole in the shutter, allowing a single beam of sunlight to pierce the gloom. He placed a glass prism in its path, watching the white light shatter into a spectrum of vivid colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. He realized that color was not a modification of white light, but its constituent parts. But his curiosity knew no safety. To understand how the eye perceived this light, he performed an experiment so reckless it makes the modern reader wince. He took a bodkin, a blunt, thick needle used for sewing leather, and wedged it between his own eye and the bone of the socket. He pressed it as near to the backside of his eye as he could, deforming the curvature of the eyeball until he saw white, dark, and colored circles bloom in his vision. He was probing the machinery of his own perception, risking blindness to see the mechanics of sight. He was fearless, driven by a hunger that transcended self-preservation. Yet this man of logic was also a keeper of deep, dark secrets. History would remember him as the first scientist, the rationalist who banished magic from the world. But in the privacy of his study, Isaac Newton was, as the economist John Maynard Keynes would later describe him, the last of the magicians. The physics that made him famous was merely a byproduct of a much grander, more obsessive quest. Newton believed that the ancients possessed a pure, divine wisdom that had been lost to corruption. He believed the Bible was a cryptogram, a puzzle set by God for him alone to solve. While the world slept, Newton's laboratory glowed with the fires of alchemy. He spent nights inhaling the toxic fumes of mercury and lead, searching for the philosopher's stone, the substance that could transmute base metals into gold and, perhaps, grant eternal life. He wrote over 1 million words on alchemy and theology, far more than he ever penned on physics. He spent decades drawing and redrawing the floor plan of Solomon's temple, convinced that its dimensions held the mathematical key to the universe's structure. He was not merely calculating gravity, he was trying to read the mind of God. This obsession came at a terrible cost. In 1693, the accumulation of stress, exhaustion, and the heavy metals poisoning his blood led to a catastrophic collapse. The Black Year descended upon him. He ceased to sleep. The rational mind that could weigh the planets fractured into paranoia. He wrote wild, accusatory letters to his few friends. He accused the philosopher John Locke of trying to embroil him with women, a bizarre charge for a man who lived a life of celibate solitude. He believed conspiracies were being hatched in the shadows. His hair, analyzed centuries later, would show mercury levels 40 times the natural limit. He was a man burning from the inside out, his nervous system corroded by the very elements he sought to master. Crucially, this breakdown coincided with the rupture of his relationship with Nicolas Fatio de Toulier, a young Swiss mathematician who had been the object of Newton's intense, albeit platonic, affection. Whatever emotional bridge Newton had tentatively built was shattered, and he retreated once more into the fortress of his own mind. When he emerged from the darkness, the man who returned was changed. The dreamy boy of Woolsthorpe was gone. In his place stood the autocrat of London, the warden of the Mint, the president of the Royal Society. He ruled British science with an iron fist. His childhood need for dominance, birthed in the schoolyard fight at Grantham, manifested now as a ruthless campaign to control his legacy. He did not tolerate rivals. When Robert Hooke, the hunchbacked genius who had dared to criticize Newton's early work on optics, died, Newton took over the Royal Society. Under his presidency, the only known portrait of Hooke mysteriously vanished, ensuring that the man's face would be erased from history. When the German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz developed calculus independently, Newton used his influence to wage a war of letters and committees, accusing Leibniz of plagiarism, determined to stamp his own name as the sole author of the mathematics of change. He sat now in his high-backed chair, the Principia, resting on the table like a tablet of commandments. He had deciphered the motion of the stars. He had broken light into its ribbons, and he had sent men to the gallows for coin-clipping. He had peered into the apocalypse, calculating from the book of Daniel that the world would end or be reborn. No sooner than the year 2060, he saw the universe not as a chaotic void, but as a great, ticking clockwork mechanism wound by a divine hand. And he, Isaac Newton, was the only one who could hear the gears turning. The silence of the library pressed in. The acclaim of the world meant little to him. It was merely noise. The true dialogue was always internal, a conversation between his intellect and the hidden architect of creation. He closed the heavy, leather-bound book, the dust motes dancing in the candlelight like the planets he had tethered with his equations. He was the master of the known world, the sovereign of science. Yet as the candle burned low, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls of his fortress, the wind seemed to pick up outside, rattling the panes, whispering of the one thing he had never been able to calculate, the one variable he could not control. The heavy velvet curtains stirred, and the draught chilled the air, carrying with it the scent of old parchment and the metallic tang of a destiny that was not yet finished with him. The stone was set, the legend carved, but the man within was still listening to the dark. And in that darkness, the mind of Isaac Newton did not rest, for it was a mind forged not in the comfort of certainty, but in the cold fires of abandonment and the fragile breath of a winter that almost claimed him before he had truly begun. To understand the gears of the universe he would one day map, one must first walk the silent, frozen fields of his beginning, back to a time when the great mathematician was nothing more than a fragile pulse in a world tearing itself apart. The story of his isolation began with his very first breath. It was Christmas Day in the year 1642, under the old calendar. England was bleeding, its people divided by civil war, the air thick with the smoke of muskets and the cries of uncertain allegiances. In the quiet hamlet of Woolsthorpe, within a grey stone manor that smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, a child was born long before his time. He was so small, so devastatingly frail, that the midwives whispered he would not see the sunset of his first day. His neck was too weak to support his head, his skin translucent against the rough linens. His mother Hannah would later tell him that he was small enough to fit inside a quart mug, a fragile vessel, for a soul that would eventually hold the weight of the cosmos. There was a hollow space in that house, a silence where a father's voice should have been. The elder Isaac Newton, a yeoman who could not sign his own name, had died 3 months before his son was born. The boy entered the world already grieving a ghost, heir to a quiet name and a fatherless home. For 3 years he was the sole focus of his mother's world, a small, sickly king in a kingdom of 2. But the universe, as he would later prove, is governed by forces that pull bodies apart as surely as they draw them together. When Isaac was 3, the first great fracture of his life occurred, a fissure that would run through his psyche until his dying day. His mother remarried. Her new husband was Barnabas Smith, a wealthy clergyman from a nearby village who had no desire to raise another man's weakling son. And so a cold transaction took place. Hannah moved to the rectory to live with her new husband, and Isaac was left behind. He was abandoned to the care of his grandmother in the shadowed corners of Woolsthorpe Manor, watching from the window as the only person he loved walked away to build a new family without him. This abandonment planted a seed of ice in his heart. For 9 years he lived as an orphan with living parents, gazing across the fields toward the church steeple where his mother now lived, a visible reminder of his exclusion. He became a solitary watcher. He did not play games with other children. He built things. He constructed intricate windmills powered by mice, water clocks that dripped the seconds of his loneliness, and paper lanterns that he flew at night to terrify the villagers with ghostly lights. He was learning that the world could be manipulated, that wood and paper and string could be bent to his will, even if people could not. But beneath the invention lay a simmering, volcanic rage. Years later, in a moment of terrifying vulnerability, a 19-year-old Newton would take a quill and record a list of his sins in a private notebook. Among the confessions of stealing cherries or eating on the Sabbath, there lay a darker admission, written in a steady hand: threatening my father and Mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. The boy who would illuminate the laws of light harbored a desire to consume his world in fire. He was not merely a quiet scholar. He was a cauldron of repressed fury, driven by a desperate need to prove his worth to a universe that had discarded him. His salvation and his weapon would be his mind. Yet even this did not come easily. When he was finally sent away to school in Grantham, lodging in the attic of an apothecary, he was initially an indifferent student. His mind was wandering, lost in the herbs and potions of the apothecary's shelves, fascinated by the transformation of matter. It took a physical blow to awaken the giant sleeping within. One morning, on the walk to school, a bullier boy who ranked above him in class kicked Isaac hard in the stomach. It was a moment of humiliation, of physical intrusion into his private world. But Newton was not the weeping infant anymore. He challenged the boy to a fight after school in the churchyard. There, amidst the gravestones, the solitary boy from Woolsthorpe fought with a feral intensity, beating his tormentor until he rubbed the boy's nose against the church wall. It was a victory of will, but for Newton, physical dominance was not enough. He needed to destroy his rival completely. He swore to surpass the boy in intellect, to climb the ranks of the school until he looked down on everyone. And he did. He rose to the top, driven not by the joy of learning but by the jagged edge of vengeance. This intensity followed him to Cambridge and then back home. In 1665, the Great Plague swept across England like a dark tide. The universities closed their gates, sending their students fleeing into the countryside to escape the pestilence. Newton, now a young man of 23, returned to Woolsthorpe. The isolation that had once been his childhood prison now became his laboratory. History would call this the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Wonders. While the world mourned and the death carts rattled through the streets of London, Newton walked the quiet orchards of Lincolnshire in a state of magnificent, hypnotic focus. The silence of the farm was absolute. There were no professors to contradict him, no rivals to shout him down. There was only the geometry of the fields, the arc of the sun, and the relentless machinery of his own mind. He sat in his darkened room, boring a tiny hole in the wooden shutter to let a single beam of sunlight pierce the gloom. He placed a glass prism in the path of that beam, watching as the white light shattered into a vibrant spectrum of colours on the far wall. It was magic, but it was magic bound by law. He realized that color was not a modification of light, but its essence. To prove his theories on optics, to understand how the eye truly received this gift of the sun, he performed an experiment so reckless it makes the modern mind recoil. He took a bodkin, a long, blunt needle used for sewing leather, and slipped it into his own eye socket, wedging it between the bone and the eyeball. He pressed the needle against the back of his eye, deforming the sphere of his vision, observing the rings of colour, the flashes of white and dark that bloomed in his sight. He was willing to risk blindness to see the truth. And then there was the apple. It is a story worn smooth by repetition, yet the truth of it is far more profound than the myth. It was not merely that a fruit fell and hit him, it was that Newton, sitting in the contemplative quiet of the garden, watched the apple detach from the branch and plummet to the grass. In that silent descent he saw a mirror of the moon. He wondered why the apple always fell perpendicular to the earth. Why did it not move sideways? Why did it not fly upward? There was a force drawing it, a ghost in the soil pulling at the heart of the fruit. And if that force could reach the top of the tree, could it not reach further? Could it reach the clouds? Could it reach the moon? In the solitude of that plague year, with only the scratching of his quill to break the silence, he tied the falling apple to the orbiting moon with a single invisible tether of mathematics. He calculated the force that kept the planets in their courses, the same force that anchored his own feet to the lonely earth of his ancestors. He was seeing the invisible scaffolding of God's creation. But to Newton, this was not the dawn of the secular age. It was a religious act. He was not merely a scientist. He was, as the economist John Maynard Keynes would later say, the last of the magicians. The portrait of the rational genius is a mask that hides the true face of the man. For Newton, The laws of gravity were of the same substance as the laws of alchemy. He spent nights tending furnaces that burned until dawn, inhaling the toxic fumes of mercury and sulfur, searching for the philosopher's stone, the divine substance that could perfect nature. He wrote 1,000,000 words on alchemy, far more than he ever published on physics. He believed that the ancient Greeks and Egyptians had known the secrets of the universe and hidden them in myths. He believed he was a chosen priest, sent to rediscover this lost wisdom. He pored over the Bible with the same obsessive scrutiny he applied to the motion of the stars, counting the measurements of Solomon's temple, convinced that its floor plan held the mathematical code of the cosmos. He calculated the prophecies of Daniel, predicting the apocalypse with the cool detachment of an accountant, determining that the world would not end before the year 2060. He was a man out of time, living with one foot in the new world of science and the other in the ancient world of sorcery. He kept his discoveries secret, hoarding them like a dragon guarding gold. He feared theft, he feared criticism. When he eventually shared his work on optics, he was attacked by Robert Hooke, a man of equal brilliance and pettiness. The criticism wounded Newton so deeply that he withdrew from public life for years, refusing to publish, letting his greatest works gather dust in his study. He engaged in brutal feuds, using his influence to crush rivals, erasing them from the records, a vindictive titan who could tolerate no shadow but his own. Yet despite the mercury poisoning that would later fray his sanity, despite the paranoia that whispered of conspiracies in the dark, the work continued. The isolation of Woolsthorpe gave way to the eminence of Cambridge, and eventually to the power of London. But the boy who had been left behind, the boy who threatened fire, never truly left him. One evening, years after the plague had passed, Newton stood by the window of his chambers, the heavy velvet drapes pulled back to reveal the cold, indifferent stars. He held a glass of water in his hand, watching the way the light bent through the liquid, distorting the world behind it. He had unravelled the rainbow, weighed the earth, and defined the laws of motion. He was the most famous man of learning in Europe. Yet he remained an enigma, a locked chest to which he had thrown away the key. He took a sip of the water, his mind drifting from the physics of refraction to the chemistry of the soul. He thought of the alchemical furnaces that still waited for him, the transmutation of base metals, the search for the divine spirit trapped in matter. The world saw a man of reason, but he knew better. He knew that the universe was a cryptogram set by the Almighty, and he was the only one with the cipher. The candle on his desk flickered, casting a long, dancing shadow that seemed to reach out toward the door, beckoning him away from the safety of his equations and back into the chaotic, messy world of men. He set the glass down. The water settled, becoming still and clear. The silence of the room was deep, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the hum of 1,000 unanswered questions, vibrating in the air like the plucked string of a celestial harp. He turned from the window, his eyes catching the glint of a coin resting on the table, a silver crown minted in the Tower of London. The metal seemed to shine with a cold, hard light, whispering of a new chapter, a new kind of alchemy where gold was not made in a furnace, but hunted in the dark alleys of the capital. The philosopher was about to become the warden. The magician was preparing to become the judge, and as he blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, the intricate clockwork of his mind shifted gears once more, turning away from the heavens to gaze down into the criminal heart of the city that awaited him. The stars would remain fixed in their courses, but the streets of London were a variable he had yet to solve. The journey from the cloistered silence of Cambridge to the soot-stained heart of London was not merely a change of address. It was a descent from the ethereal to the terrestrial. The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones, a rhythmic percussion that replaced the quiet scratching of his quill. Outside the window, the air grew thick with coal smoke, and the fog of the river, veiling the city in a grey shroud that seemed to mirror the secrets hidden within his own mind. He had spent half a lifetime decoding the laws of the heavens, tracing the invisible threads of gravity that bound the moon to the earth. But now he was entering a world governed by laws far more capricious, the laws of men, of greed, and of gold. To understand the man who now stepped onto the damp stones of the capital, one had to look backward, peering through the lens of time to a farmhouse in Lincolnshire, to a Christmas morning long ago. He had arrived into the world too soon. A fragile, tiny thing, small enough, as his mother had whispered, to fit inside a quart mug. He was a child born into a fatherless house, his own father having passed into the earth 3 months before his son ever drew breath. This initial absence was the first variable in the equation of his life, a 0 where a 1 should have been. But the true fracture, the wound that would never fully heal, opened when he was just 3 years old. His mother Hannah, the only anchor in his small universe, made a choice that would cast a long, cold shadow over his soul. She remarried a wealthy clergyman, a man named Barnabas Smith, who had no desire to raise another man's son. And so the boy was left behind. He watched from the window of his grandmother's house as his mother walked away to a new life in a neighbouring village, leaving him in a magnificent, terrible isolation. For 9 years he lived with the ghost of her abandonment. The resentment simmered in his chest, a volatile chemical reaction waiting for a spark. It was a rage so profound that, years later, when he sought to purify his soul by listing his transgressions, he would write down a confession that chilled the page it was written on. In a list of 57 sins, amidst the trivialities of youth, lay the raw confession of a wounded heart, threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. The genius who would one day illuminate the world had once wished to set it on fire, driven by the primal pain of a boy who felt discarded. This solitary darkness forged a steel spine. At school in Grantham, he was initially a ghost, drifting through his lessons, until the day the world tried to break him physically. A bully, stronger and louder, kicked him in the stomach, a visceral violation of his space. But the boy who would map the forces of the universe did not crumble. He challenged the aggressor to a fight in the churchyard. There, amidst the gravestones, he fought with a desperate, precise fury, defeating the boy and rubbing his face into the church wall. But physical victory was not enough. He needed to dominate. He applied that same ferocious energy to his books, rising to become the top student, learning that knowledge was power, and that to be untouchable, one had to be undeniable. It was this same relentless drive that he carried into the solitude of his adulthood. The world saw a physicist, a mathematician of cool logic, but the man in the mirror was something else entirely. He was, as would later be whispered, not the first of the age of reason, but the last of the magicians. In the flickering candlelight of his chambers, far from the prying eyes of the Royal Society, he did not just study motion. He hunted for the spirit of God in matter. He spent nights bent over crucibles, inhaling the acrid fumes of sulphur and mercury, searching for the philosopher's stone, the divine agent that could transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal life. He wrote over 1 million words on alchemy, far more than he ever penned on physics, believing that the ancients held secrets that had been lost to time. His laboratory was a place of transformation, where the boundaries between science and sorcery dissolved in the heat of the furnace. His thirst for truth led him to experiment upon the only instrument he could fully control, himself. In a moment of terrifying curiosity, seeking to understand how the eye perceived colour and light, he took a bodkin blunt needle used for sewing and slipped it into his own eye socket. He wedged the metal between the bone and the eyeball, pressing it as near to the back of his eye as he could, manipulating the pressure until he saw white, dark, and coloured circles bloom in his vision. He risked blindness to see what others could not, treating his own body as mere apparatus in the pursuit of knowledge. But the mind, like the eye, can only withstand so much pressure before it begins to distort. The relentless inhalation of mercury vapours, the sleepless nights, and a crushing weight of his own intellect eventually took their toll. In the year 1693, the magnificent clockwork of his mind began to strip its gears. It was a year of darkness, a black year where the line between genius and madness blurred. He barely slept. Paranoia, thick and suffocating, wrapped around him. He wrote wild, erratic letters to his few friends, accusing the philosopher John Locke of trying to embroil him with women and believing that conspiracies were being hatched in the shadows. This breakdown was perhaps exacerbated by the rupture of his most intense emotional connection, his friendship with the young Swiss mathematician Nicolas Fatio-Dedulier. When that bond severed, the isolation he had known as a boy in Woolsthorpe returned with a vengeance. He was alone again, adrift in a cosmos that felt increasingly cold. It was from the ashes of this breakdown that the warden emerged. Leaving the toxicity of his laboratory and the memories of Cambridge behind, he moved to London to take command of the Royal Mint. He did not treat this as a gentle retirement. The man who had organized the heavens now sought to organize the currency of the realm. The great recoinage was underway, a massive logistical undertaking to replace the clipped and battered silver coins of England, and he threw himself into the task with the same obsessive energy he had applied to the orbit of comets. But the Mint had enemies. Counterfeiters, known as kiners, infested the city, leeching the value from the nation's money. The most notorious among them was William Challoner, a master forger and confidence man who lived by his wits, mocking the law. To catch him, the philosopher became a detective. He shed his velvet robes and donned disguises, venturing into the gin-soaked taverns and the dark, labyrinthine alleys of London's underworld. He sat in corners, a shadow within shadows, listening to the whispers of thieves and informants. He established a network of spies, paying for information, turning accomplices against their masters. He interrogated suspects with a terrifying icy calm, cross-examining them until their stories fell apart. He was no longer the distant scholar. He was the hand of justice, unyielding and precise. The pursuit of Challoner became a personal duel. Challoner, arrogant and reckless, underestimated the warden, mistaking him for a mere academic. He did not know he was dealing with the boy who had once sworn to burn a house down, the man who had pressed a needle into his own eye. The trap closed slowly, methodically. The evidence was gathered, the witnesses secured. When Challoner finally stood upon the gallows, disemboweled for his treason against the crown, it was the final proof that in the warden's universe, every action had an equal and opposite reaction. Yet, even as he brought order to the chaotic streets of London, his mind never truly left the divine mysteries. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city finally slept, he would return to his private manuscripts. He was obsessed with the dimensions of King Solomon's temple, believing that its floor plan held a mathematical code for the universe, a divine blueprint hidden in Scripture. He pored over the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation, calculating the chronology of ancient kingdoms with the same rigor he applied to the tides. On scraps of parchment hidden away from the world, he wrote his own prophecies. He calculated that the world as humanity knew it, the great cycle of history, would come to its conclusion, its apocalypse or perhaps its renewal, no sooner than the year 2060. To him, the Bible was a puzzle set by the Almighty, and he believed he had been chosen to solve it. He rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, a heresy that he kept secret to protect his position, believing that the true religion had been corrupted by centuries of error. He was a man of contradictions, a scientist who practiced alchemy, a warden who hunted criminals, a heretic who led the establishment. His library was a testament to his ferocious hunger for knowledge. He possessed over 1,600 books, and he read them with a brutality that matched his intellect. He would dog-ear the pages so aggressively that the corners pointed like arrows to the specific lines he wished to remember, marking his territory in the landscape of ideas. He engaged in bitter, lifelong feuds, driven by a deep-seated insecurity that perhaps harked back to the abandoned child. He erased his rivals, like Robert Hooke, from the records of history, ensuring that only his own light would shine. When the German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz claimed to have invented calculus, he launched a campaign of anonymous attacks, using the Royal Society as his personal weapon to crush the opposition. As the years advanced and his hair turned to silver, mirroring the coins he protected, he became an icon, a living statue of reason. But inside, the fire still burned. The last magician sat in his high-backed chair, surrounded by the dog-eared books and the stacks of parchment filled with prophetic calculations. The candle flame danced in the draught, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls of his study. He looked down at his hands, hands that had touched the raw materials of the universe, from the cold glass of a prism to the hot metal of the crucible. He had sought to know the mind of God, to trace the nerves of the divine being that permeated all space. The silence of the room was heavy, not with emptiness, but with presence. He closed the heavy leather-bound tome in front of him, the dust mote swirling in the disturbed air. The city outside was a complex machine of commerce and crime, but he had mastered it. The heavens were a clockwork of gravity and light, and he had deciphered them. Now, as the final chapter of his long life began to approach, his thoughts turned inward, to the only mystery that remained unsolved, the transition from the world of matter to the world of spirit. He picked up his quill one last time for the night, the ink dark and glistening, ready to capture one more thought before the candle burned down to the wax. The ink flowed onto the page, a river of black thoughts in a sea of white paper, carrying him gently toward the next horizon. That horizon, however, was often obscured by the thick, sulphurous fog of London, a city that breathed smoke and exhaled corruption. When Newton had descended from the ivory towers of Cambridge to the grimy cobblestone streets of the capital, he had not come to rest. The wardenship of the Royal Mint was intended by his patrons to be a comfortable sinecure, a reward for the great philosopher that required little more than a signature and a nod. But to Isaac Newton, the very idea of a figurehead was anathema. If there was a system, it must be understood. If there was a flaw, it must be corrected. The currency of England was in ruins, clipped by thieves and counterfeited by opportunists. And to Newton, this was not merely an economic crisis. It was a violation of the natural order, a mathematical impurity that he was compelled to purge. He cast off the robes of the academic and donned the cloak of the inquisitor. The mind that had encompassed the moon and the tides now narrowed its terrible focus to the dens of iniquity in the city's darkest corners. There were nights when the warden was not found in his comfortable quarters, but in the smoky, ale-stained tap-rooms of Cheapside and Southwark, disguised in drab, nondescript habits, his silver hair hidden. He sat quietly in the shadows, nursing a drink he barely touched, listening to the loose tongues of coiners and informants. He was gathering data, just as he had gathered the positions of the stars, but here the variables were human greed and treachery. His great adversary in this terrestrial war was William Challoner, a man of flamboyant criminality, a master forger, who had grown rich mocking the laws that Newton held sacred. Challoner lived as a gentleman, confident that he could outwit a university professor. He did not understand that he was not facing a mere man, but a force of nature. Newton pursued him with a cold, relentless precision. He organized networks of spies, cross-examined witnesses with the terrifying rigor of a divine judge, and constructed a web of evidence so tight that no light could escape it. When Challoner finally stood on the gallows at Tyburn, awaiting the rope and the knife, it was the final integer in a long equation that Newton had balanced with blood. Yet this relentless drive for order in the outer world was often a desperate attempt to quell the disorder within. The mind of the genius was a fortress, but it was besieged by invisible enemies. A few years prior, in the black year of 1693, the walls had nearly crumbled. It was a time of distemper, as he called it, a period when the fabric of reality seemed to fray at the edges. He had gone 5 nights without sleep, his eyes wide and burning, the thoughts racing faster than his quill could catch them. He had written letters, wild, frantic missives to his oldest friends, accusing them of conspiracies that existed only in the fevered pathways of his own brain. He had written to Samuel Pepys, declaring that he would see him no more. He had written to John Locke, the philosopher of reason, apologizing for wishing him dead, apologizing for the thought that Locke had tried to embroil him with women. The shame of those letters still lingered in the silence of his study, a reminder of how fragile the thread of sanity truly was. Some whispered that the fire in his mind had been lit by the furnaces of his laboratory. For decades, Newton had breathed the fumes of mercury and lead, tasting the metallic sweetness of the alchemical transformation. His hair, beneath his wig, held the chemical signature of his obsession levels of mercury, 40 times that of a normal man. The poison had seeped into his nerves, turning the melancholy of his temperament into a paranoid storm. But perhaps the poison was not just chemical. Perhaps it was the heartbreak of a quiet, private devastation. The rupture of his intense bond with the young Swiss mathematician, Nicolas Fatio de Doulier. Fatio had been the mirror to Newton's soul, a brilliant intellect that reflected his own. They had shared the deepest secrets of the universe, whispering of gravity and God in the cloisters of the university. When that friendship fractured, withdrawing into a sudden, icy silence, it left a void that no amount of calculation could fill. Newton, who had never known the touch of a woman, who had held himself apart from the messy entanglements of human love, found himself adrift in a sea of loneliness that calculus could not map. He'd always been willing to suffer for the truth. He remembered the recklessness of his youth, the way he had treated his own body as a laboratory instrument. In his quest to understand the nature of light and colour, he had not been content to merely observe. He needed to know how the eye itself constructed the world. He recalled the cold steel of the bodkin, a blunt needle used for sewing leather, which he had taken in his hand one quiet afternoon in his chambers. With a steady, terrifying calmness, he had slipped the bodkin between his eye and the bone of the socket, pressing it down as far as it would go to reach the back of the curvature. He had pressed the tool against the eyeball, deforming the sphere, watching with scientific detachment as the pressure triggered hallucinations of color. White, dark, and colored circles appeared in his vision, phantoms of light summoned by pain. He shifted the needle, noting how the circles changed, mapping the geometry of his own perception. It was a gruesome act of curiosity, a testament to a will that prioritized knowledge above safety, above comfort, above sight itself. He was a man who would risk blindness to see what lay beyond the veil. This proprietary claim over the nature of light had birthed the other great war of his life, the long, bitter crusade against Robert Hooke. If Challoner was the thief of coins, Hooke was the thief of glory. Hooke, with his hunchback and his grasp of many sciences but mastery of few, had dared to suggest that Newton's theories on light and gravity were borrowed from his own. The accusation was a spark that fell into the dry tinder of Newton's insecurity. Newton did not just want to defeat Hooke, he wanted to erase him. He waited until Hooke was cold in his grave, and then, as president of the Royal Society, he methodically dismantled his rival's legacy. Instruments were removed, papers were shelved, and famously, the only known portrait of Robert Hooke vanished, leaving a blank space in history where a man's face should have been. Newton was the giant upon whose shoulders others stood, but he made sure the ground beneath him was cleared of competitors. But these public battles, the wars of light and coinage, were merely distractions from the true work that consumed the candlelit hours. The world knew him as the father of reason, the man who banished magic from the universe. They were wrong. As he sat in the heavy silence of the night, surrounded by his thousands of books with their dog-eared corners pointing like arrows to hidden truths, Newton knew he was not the first of the scientists, but the last of the magicians. His trunk was filled not with mathematics but with theology and alchemy. He had written millions of words that the world would never see, dense, feverish treatises on the nature of the Trinity, which he secretly rejected as a corruption of the true faith. He was an Arian, a heretic in the eyes of the Church. He outwardly served, believing that Christ was the Son of God but not his equal. To speak this aloud would be to lose everything: his position, his home, his freedom. So he locked the heresy away in his chest, a secret fire burning alongside the mercury. He turned his gaze to the papers before him. They were covered in sketches, not of trajectories or prisms, but of architectural floor plans. For years he had obsessed over the Temple of Solomon. He believed the ancient structure was not merely a building, but a divine code, a physical manifestation of the wisdom of the ancients. If he could reconstruct the exact dimensions of the temple, he believed he could unlock the chronology of the world and predict the apocalypse. His quill scratched against the parchment, tracing the cubits and the holy chambers. He had run the numbers through the prophecies of Daniel and the revelation of St. John. The calculations were intricate, a blend of history, astronomy, and scripture. He had arrived at a date, a distant shore in the river of time. The world, he had concluded, would face its great tribulation, the end of the age, no sooner than the year 2060. It was a comfort to him, a mathematical assurance that the divine plan was unfolding according to a schedule that could be known by the righteous. The candle flickered, the shadows stretching long and thin across the room, dancing over the alchemical furnaces that stood cold and silent in the corner. He was a man of two worlds, the visible and the invisible. He had explained the falling apple and the orbiting moon, but he knew they were merely the mechanics of a deeper reality. Gravity was the hand of God, moving through the empty vastness of space, a constant, willful presence that held the universe together. He rubbed his eyes, the same eyes that had once withstood the pressure of the bodkin, feeling the weight of his years, the anger, the ambition, the desperate need for control, it all quieted as the night deepened. He was the keeper of the keys, the interpreter of the two great books, the book of nature and the book of scripture. He had sought to unify them, to prove that the God of the Bible was the same God of the calculus. The city outside had fallen into a hush, the fog swallowing the sounds of the streets. Newton set down his quill. The ink was wet, a glistening black mirror reflecting the dim light. The work was never truly finished. There was always another cipher to break, another variable to isolate. But for now, the equation was stable. He breathed in the cool air of the room, tasting the dust of old books and the faint, lingering scent of metal. His mind, forever racing, began to slow its revolutions, preparing to drift from the realm of hard geometry into the softer, fluid landscapes of memory and dream. The silence of the room deepened, becoming a vast, welcoming ocean, and the solitary genius sat at its shore, watching the tide of the night roll in. The silence of the room was not merely an absence of sound, but a vast, resonant chamber where memory echoed longer and louder than the chiming of any clock. As the tide of the night rolled in, carrying the solitary genius upon its dark waves, the present moment began to dissolve. The stone walls of London faded, replaced by the damp, earthen chill of a Lincolnshire winter, drifting back to the very beginning of the calculation. He remembered the cold. It was a cold that had seeped into his bones before he had even taken his first breath. He had been born into a world that did not expect him, arriving on a Christmas morning long ago, small enough, as his mother had whispered, to fit inside a quart mug. He was a fragile thing, a tiny trembling variable in a harsh equation, fatherless before he was born. The man whose name he bore was already in the ground, a ghost that would haunt the edges of his life, leaving him to navigate the geometry of existence without a compass. But the true cold, the ice that would freeze his heart and sharpen his mind into a diamond-hard instrument, came 3 years later. It was the sight of his mother walking away. She had chosen a new life, a new husband, the wealthy clergyman, Barnabas Smith, a man who had no room in his grand house for a stepson. Young Isaac was left behind in the care of a grandmother, watching the figure of his mother recede down the lane, a vanishing point on the horizon of his childhood. In that abandonment, a fracture formed a deep, seismic rift between trust and solitude. He learned then that the world was unstable, that love was a variable that could be subtracted without warning. In the long, quiet years that followed, the silence of the farmhouse became his tutor. He built windmills and watercocks, small mechanical universes that he could control, worlds where no one left and nothing changed without his permission. But beneath the invention lay a simmering volcanic rage. It was a fire he kept stoked in the furnace of his secret self. Years later, in a moment of terrifying confession, he would write down the sins of his youth, scratching the ink into the paper with a trembling hand. There, amidst the mundane transgressions, lay the burning coal of his resentment, threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. The shy, silent boy held a universe of fury behind his eyes. He carried this intensity to school in Grantham, where he was an indifferent scholar until the physical world collided with him, A kick to the stomach from a schoolyard bully awakened a dormant force. Isaac did not just fight back. He dismantled his opponent. Behind the church, he won the physical battle, rubbing the boy's nose against the wall, but that was not enough. He needed total victory. He applied the same relentless energy to his books, climbing the ranks until he stood alone at the top, peerless and untouchable. It was a pattern that would define his life, the transformation of pain into power, of slight into dominance. Then came the plague. The great silence that fell over England in 1665 sent him back to the isolation of Woolsthorpe. The university closed, the voices ceased, and in that magnificent isolation the universe opened its coat to him. He sat in the orchard, not merely watching apples fall, but seeing the invisible threads that bound the moon to the earth. He was 23 years old, and in the quiet of his country home he invented the mathematics of change. But his curiosity was a hunger that knew no safety. To understand the nature of light, to know why the world was coloured, he undertook experiments that would make a lesser man shudder. He took a bodkin, a blunt needle used for sewing, and slipped it between his own eye and the bone of the socket. He pressed it back, deforming the shape of his eye, risking blindness to see the white, dark and coloured circles that bloomed in the pressure. He was mapping the mechanics of perception itself, treating his own body as a laboratory, pressing against the limits of what a human being was meant to endure. Yet for all his geometric precision, Newton was not merely a creature of cold reason. As the night deepened in his memory, the scene shifted from the clean lines of optics to the smoky, sulphurous den of his secret obsession. He was, as history would one day whisper, the last of the magicians. While the world praised his Principia, his true passion burned in the crucible. For 30 years he laboured over the fires of alchemy, seeking the philosopher's stone, the divine agent that could purify base metals and, perhaps, the human soul. He spent sleepless nights inhaling the toxic fumes of mercury, the quicksilver that fascinated him. He tasted the metals, literally testing the bitter metallic tang of his experiments, oblivious or indifferent to the poison accumulating in his blood. The mercury seeped into him 40 times the natural level, a heavy, fluid madness taking root in his nervous system. It was this pursuit of hidden knowledge, this desire to read the mind of God through chemical fire, that led to the abyss of 1693. The black year descended like a heavy curtain. The mercury mine shattered. He went days without sleep, his thoughts racing faster than the planets he had charted. Paranoia set in, a thick fog that obscured the loyalty of his friends. He wrote wild, accusatory letters to John Locke and Samuel Pepys, convinced they were conspiring to entrap him with women or ruin his reputation. The loss of his intense companionship with the young Swiss mathematician Fatio de Doulier severed his last tether to emotional stability. He was alone in a whirlwind of his own making, a mind spinning out of orbit, burning with the fever of heavy metals and broken trust. But the mind of Newton was resilient, forged in the fires of trauma. He emerged from the breakdown not softer, but harder. He left the cloisters of Cambridge for the grime and power of London, accepting the post of Warden of the Royal Mint. He did not treat it as a retirement. He treated it as a war. The alchemist became the detective. He donned disguises, slipping into the dark taverns and gin houses of the city, listening to the whispers of coin clippers and counterfeiters. His nemesis was the master forger William Challoner, a man who thought he could outwit the professor. But Challoner did not understand that he was playing a game against a man who had calculated the motion of comets. Newton built his case with the same meticulous care he applied to his equations. He cross-examined witnesses, gathered intelligence, and slowly, methodically, tightened the noose. There was no mercy in him, only the cold, absolute law of gravity. He watched as Challoner was dragged to the scaffold, hanged and disemboweled, a grim solution to a societal equation. Yet even as he brought order to the currency, his mind remained fixed on the ultimate order. He was a priest of a hidden religion, rejecting the Trinity, searching the floor plans of Solomon's temple for the mathematical code of the universe. He believed he was chosen, a prophet sent to decode the books of Daniel and Revelation. He dog-eared his library of 1,600 books, aggressively folding the pages to point like arrows to the truths he had found. He calculated the end of days, looking far into the future, predicting that the veil of the world would not be torn before the year 2060. The night air in the room grew heavy, charged with the weight of these memories. The old man sat in the stillness, the mercury mind finally calming as the hours stretched toward dawn. He had been the boy in the quart mug, the vengeful son, the fighter in the churchyard, the sorcerer in the smoke, and the judge in the mint. All these variables existed simultaneously within him, held together by the sheer force of his will. The candle on his desk sputtered, the flame dipping low, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like the shapes of old rivals and lost friends. His eyelids grew heavy, the weight of the universe pressing down softly. The ink was dry, the equations were set. The connection between the falling apple and the rising moon was forged in iron and logic, but the connection between the man and his peace was more fragile, woven from the gossamer threads of sleep. He allowed his head to rest against the high back of the chair, his breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the sleeping city outside. The relentless motion of his thoughts began to decelerate, the centrifuge of his genius slowing to a gentle, hypnotic spin. He was no longer calculating the end of the world or the composition of light. He was simply Isaac, drifting on the surface of the great ocean of truth, listening to the wave lap against the shore of his consciousness. The complexity of the calculus faded into a simple rhythmic hum. The tension in his shoulders released, the armor of the genius falling away to reveal the weary soul beneath. The fog outside pressed against the glass, a soft, white blanket wrapping the house in quietude. And in that deepening silence, the boundary between the waking world and the realm of dreams began to blur, offering a sanctuary where no proofs were required and no variables needed to be solved. The mind that had encompassed the cosmos now sought only the quiet, dark, ready to surrender to the peaceful gravity of sleep. And in that deep, resonant silence, the stillness of the countryside began to dissolve, replaced not by the chirping of birds or the rustling of leaves, but by a heavier, more metallic atmosphere. The dream of the ocean of truth receded, and the reality of a new burden settled upon his shoulders, a weight as tangible as the gravity he had once defined. The mist of the fenlands thickened, curling and darkening until it became the cloying coal smoke of London in the year 1696. Isaac Newton had left the cloistered stone walls of Cambridge, stepping away from the solitude of his rooms where light was split and stars were charted. He had descended from the ivory tower into the churning, chaotic belly of the capital. He was 53 years old, his hair turning the colour of silver, his eyes sharper and colder than they had ever been. He had been appointed Warden of the Royal Mint, a position the establishment viewed as a comfortable sinecure, a gentle retirement for a famous scholar where the only requirement was to sign papers and collect a salary. But those who thought Isaac Newton would rest had misunderstood the fundamental architecture of his mind. He was incapable of passivity. To him, the universe was a puzzle to be solved, and now the puzzle was made of gold, silver, and the treasonous intent of men. He took up residence within the formidable walls of the Tower of London, a fortress of grey stone and bloody history. Here the air did not smell of parchment and wax, but of sulphur, melting metal, and the damp rot of the Thames. The Royal Mint was in crisis. The currency of England was collapsing. For decades, thieves known as clippers had been shearing the edges off silver coins, melting the shavings down to sell, leaving the coins light and jagged. The nation's wealth was literally evaporating, the integrity of the pound compromised by thousands of tiny, invisible cuts. To Newton, this was not merely an economic problem, it was an offence against order. Just as he had sought the absolute laws that govern the motion of the planets, he now sought to impose absolute laws upon the motion of money. A coin was a standard, a fixed unit of value in a chaotic world. To tamper with it was to tamper with truth itself. The alchemist who had spent nights trying to transmute base metals in secret crucibles now stood as the guardian of the realm's purity. He became the Iron Warden. The transformation was total. The man who had once forgotten to eat for days while pondering the geometry of curbs now applied that same obsessive focus to the eradication of crime. He did not delegate. He did not sleep. He turned the full, terrifying force of his intellect toward the underworld of London. The Mint became a machine of efficiency. He analyzed the production rates of the coin presses with the same mathematical rigor he had applied to the orbit of the moon. He reorganized the shifts, the machinery, and the security, increasing the output of new, milled coins with edged ridges that could not be clipped until the Mint was roaring like a great beast, stamping out order from chaos, thousands of coins per hour. But stamping new coins was only half the equation. The other half was hunting down those who corrupted them. And so the author of the Principia became a detective. In the deepening twilight of the London fog, a figure would often slip out of the tower gates. He was cloaked in drab wool, his famous face hidden beneath the brim of a low hat. His posture stooped to disguise his stature. Isaac Newton descended into the labyrinth of the city's taverns and gin houses, places of squalor and shadow where the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and conspiracy. He sat in the corners of crowded public houses in the notorious district of Seven Dials, nursing a tankard of ale he barely touched. Listening, he was gathering data. Just as he had once collected observations of the tides, he now collected whispers. He built a network of informants, utilizing the desperate and the damned, paying for secrets with coin and promises of leniency. He learned the language of the streets, the slang of the forgers and the thieves. He studied the criminal mind as if it were a specimen under a microscope, noting its habits, its weaknesses, and its predictable trajectories. His primary target was a man named William Challoner. Challoner was everything. Newton was not flamboyant, reckless, a charlatan who had made a fortune counterfeiting French pistoles and English guineas. Challoner was a master of deception, a man who had played the government for fools, even audaciously offering to help the Mint catch counterfeiters while he was forging coins in his own basement. He mocked the law, he mocked the crown, and, fatally, he mocked Isaac Newton. Challoner believed he was playing a game of wits against a dusty academic, a man of books who would be easily outmaneuvered in the rough streets. He did not realize he had drawn the attention of a mind that could hold the entire cosmos in check. Newton did not react with public anger. He reacted with cold, inexorable pressure. He began to compile a dossier. For months, Newton worked with a terrifying patience. He interrogated hundreds of witnesses, thieves, prostitutes, and accomplices, bringing them into the tower for questioning. He did not shout, he dissected. He found the inconsistencies in their stories with the precision of a logician finding an error in a proof. He cross-referenced dates, places, and weights of metal. He was relentless. The vast, tangled web of Challoner's criminal empire was slowly mapped out, strand by strand, until there was no corner left in shadow. The conflict was a clash of two worlds, the chaotic, fluid world of the trickster versus the rigid, immutable world of the scientist. Newton viewed Challoner not just as a criminal, but as a variable that refused to fit the equation, and in Newton's universe, rogue variables were eliminated. The net tightened. The evidence accumulated, stacks of depositions written in Newton's own cramped, precise hand. He pursued Challoner through the courts with a doggedness that bordered on vindictiveness. When Challoner tried to use his connections to wiggle free, Newton was there, blocking the exit with a wall of irrefutable fact. When Challoner tried to bribe his way out, he found that the warden was impervious to gold. For the warden knew the true value of things, and his integrity was a substance harder than diamond. Finally, the trap snapped shut. Challoner was arrested and brought to trial. The evidence Newton had gathered was overwhelming. The dusty academic had outwitted the master criminal at his own game. Challoner, realizing too late the magnitude of his opponent, wrote pleading letters to Newton from his cell in Newgate prison. He begged for mercy, appealing to Newton's charity, to his Christian soul. "Save me from being murdered," he wrote. "Oh dear sir, do this merciful deed." But Isaac Newton was not in a merciful mood. He was the agent of divine order. He did not reply. He let the law of gravity take its course, just as surely as an apple falls from a tree. On a cold grey morning in March 1699, William Challoner was dragged on a sledge to Tyburn Tree. He was hanged until dead, his body a grim testament to the consequences of defying the laws of the realm and the will of the warden. Newton did not attend the execution. He did not need to see the result. The calculation had been finished, the outcome inevitable. He remained in the Mint, listening to the rhythmic thud of the coin presses, the heavy, mechanical heartbeat of the nation's economy, beating strong and pure once more. The metal was sound, the dross had been purged. With the great recoinage complete and the counterfeiters broken, a strange calm settled over Newton's life in London. The intensity of the hunt faded, leaving behind the polished surface of a man who had conquered yet another domain. He had proven that his mind was not limited to the abstract. He could bend the physical world and the people in it to his will. He was now Sir Isaac Newton, President of the Royal Society, a figure of immense power and terrified respect. Yet, as the years marched on, the fire that had fueled the Principia and the purge of the Mint began to cool into a steady, hard ember. The volatile mercury of his youth had stabilized. He walked the halls of London society, a living monument, revered by a world that could barely comprehend the scope of his thoughts. But deep within the secret chambers of his heart, the old obsession still whispered. The public saw the scientist, the warden, the icon of reason. They did not see the man who still spent his nights surrounded by ancient chronologies, trying to date the events of the Bible, trying to fit the history of mankind into a mathematical framework as rigorous as the motion of the stars. He moved through the high-ceilinged rooms of his London home, the sounds of the city muffled by heavy velvet drapes, the candlelight reflected off the silver of his hair and the silver of the coins he had saved. He was alone, as he had always been, but it was a loneliness filled with the crowded architecture of his own theories. He had organized the heavens, and he had organized the earth. Now he turned his gaze toward the final frontier of his long and arduous journey, the organization of time itself, and the legacy he would leave behind in the great, silent library of eternity. The heavy oak door of his study clicked shut, sealing out the draughts of the house. He sat at his desk, the wood worn smooth by decades of study, and dipped his quill into the inkwell one more time. The scratching of the nib against the paper was a slow, rhythmic sound, like the ticking of a clock winding down. He was no longer the young man beneath the apple tree, nor the fierce warden in the tavern shadows. He was a vessel of history, preparing to set his final seal upon the age. The ink flowed dark and wet, capturing the fading light of a mind that had burned brighter than any other, tracing the lines of a thought that sought to bridge the gap between the finite and the infinite. The ink that flowed from his quill was black, but in his mind it shimmered like liquid silver, heavy and cold. He had spent a lifetime chasing the light of God through the prism of mathematics, but in the latter years of the 17th century, Isaac Newton descended from the celestial spheres to the muddy, chaotic streets of London. He left behind the stone silence of Cambridge, a sanctuary where he had unravelled the rainbow and weighed the planets, to enter the dark heart of the English capital. It was a transition that few understood, a shift from the ethereal to the material. Yet to Newton, it was merely another problem of motion and force. He had organized the heavens. Now he was called upon to organize the coin of the realm. In 1696, the great mind moved to the Tower of London. The position of Warden of the Royal Mint was often treated as a sinecure, a gentle retirement for distinguished gentlemen who wished to collect a salary and sleep through their duties. But Isaac Newton did not know how to sleep through anything. His mind was a furnace that never cooled. When he arrived at the tower, surrounded by the thick stone walls and the ominous ravens that hopped along the battlements, he found a system in varying states of decay. The currency of England was collapsing. For generations, people had been clipping the edges off silver coins, melting down the shavings, and passing the diminished currency back into trade. The coins were light, misshapen, and debased, to a man who believed in the absolute precision of the universe. where every action had an equal and opposite reaction. This corruption of value was not just a crime, it was a heresy. It was a lie told in metal. He approached the problem with the same terrifying focus he had applied to the orbit of the moon. The mint became his laboratory. He reorganized the smelting schedules, calculated the precise movements of men and machines, and optimized the coal furnaces until the production of new, milled coins with ridged edges that could not be clipped flowed like a silver river. But creating new money was only half the equation. The other half was destroying the counterfeiters who threatened the sanctity of the king's currency. The philosopher became the warden, and the warden became the hunter. There is a deep, rhythmic irony in the image of the world's greatest scientist, the man who had deciphered the secrets of gravity, donning a disguise to walk the foggy, labyrinthine streets of London's underworld. He did not delegate this dirty work. Driven by a relentless compulsion for truth, Newton shed his velvet coat and donned the rough garb of a commoner. He frequented the gin-houses and the smoky taverns of Southwark, sitting in the shadows, nursing a tankard of ale he barely touched, and listening. He was gathering data. Every whisper, every boast of a coin-clipper, every rumour of a false die was a variable in a new equation he was solving. The streets of London in the late 17th century were a sensory assault, a stark contrast to the sterile geometry of his notebooks. The air hung thick with the smell of coal smoke and the damp rot of the Thames, a fog that clung to the cobblestones and obscured the stars he loved so dearly. But Newton moved through it with a singular purpose. He was building a network of informants, paying for secrets with the same cold calculation he used to pay for alchemical mercury. He tracked the flow of false coin through the markets, tracing it back to its source, mapping the criminal networks just as he had mapped the trajectory of a comet. His primary adversary in this terrestrial battle was a man named William Challoner. Challoner was everything Newton was not: flamboyant, reckless, a charlatan who thrived on chaos and deceit. He was a master counterfeiter who had grown rich by mocking the crown's authority, a man who believed he could outsmart the system because the system was slow and blind. But he had not accounted for Isaac Newton. Challoner saw the mint as a bureaucracy. Newton saw it as a divine instrument of order. The conflict between them was inevitable, a collision of two opposing forces. Newton pursued Challoner with a vindictiveness that revealed the darker hues of his complex psyche. This was the same man who had kept a list of his childhood sins, who had felt the burning heat of resentment against his stepfather, and who had engaged in bitter, life feuds with fellow natural philosophers. To Newton, Challoner was not merely a criminal. He was an agent of disorder, a variable that needed to be eliminated to balance the equation. The warden of the mint became a relentless detective, deposing hundreds of witnesses, cross-referencing their testimonies, and building a case so watertight that it resembled a geometric proof. The archives of the mint filled with the dark scribblings of these interrogations. Newton would sit across from the accused, his heavy-lidded eyes unblinking, his voice soft but terrifyingly precise. He dismantled their alibis with logic. He found the contradictions in their stories and pried them open until the truth spilled out. He showed no mercy, for in his worldview, mercy was a deviation from justice. The law, like gravity, was absolute. If a man stepped off a ledge, he fell. If a man forged the king's coin, he paid the price. The culmination of this grim pursuit came when Challoner was finally captured and brought to trial. Newton did not attend the execution, but his invisible hand was the one that pulled the lever. In March of 1699, William Challoner was dragged on a sledge to Tyburn, the notorious hanging tree of London. The crowds gathered to watch the spectacle, a sea of faces upturned in the grey light. To the common observer, it was just another hanging, a brutal piece of theatre in a brutal age. But in the grand, silent library of Newton's mind, it was the final stroke of a pen, the closing of a parenthesis, as Challoner's body swung from the rope, oscillating like a pendulum in the damp wind. The laws of physics and the laws of the realm converged. The chaotic element had been removed. The coin was pure again. Newton remained in the tower, surrounded by his papers, his task complete. He had proven that he could master the earth just as he had mastered the heavens. But the victory brought no joy, only the cold satisfaction of a problem solved, a chaotic system restored to equilibrium. This period of his life, so far removed from the apple orchard of Woolsthorpe, left its mark on him. The relentless grinding of the bureaucratic machine, the proximity to the furnace and the gallows hardened him. The man who had once pressed a needle into his own eye to understand colour now looked upon the world with a gaze that was increasingly detached, seeing human lives as particles in a vast, mechanical suspension. He had saved the economy of England, pulling it back from the brink of collapse through sheer force of will and intellect. But the alchemist within him was still searching for a different kind of gold. The metal of the coins was merely a symbol. Newton's true obsession, the fire that burned beneath the heavy wig and the velvet coat, remained the transmutation of wisdom. He believed that the ancients possessed a pristine truth, a prisca sapientia, that had been lost and corrupted over time. Much like the clicked coins he had spent years recalling and recasting, he saw himself as a restorer not just of currency but of knowledge. Whether it was the floor plan of Solomon's temple, the prophecies of Daniel, or the laws of motion, it was all the same work, scrubbing away the grime of history to reveal the shining, mathematical structure of God's design beneath. As the 18th century dawned, Newton stood at the pinnacle of his fame. He was knighted by Queen Anne, becoming Sir Isaac, the first scientist to be so honoured. He was elected president of the Royal Society, a position he would hold with an iron grip for decades. The shy, solitary scholar who had forgotten to eat while pondering the tides was now a figure of immense power and authority, a titan who cast a long shadow over the intellectual landscape of Europe. Yet, in the quiet of his private chambers, the old anxieties lingered. The mercury fumes from his decades of alchemical experiments may have settled in his nerves, amplifying the paranoia and the solitary nature of his existence. He lived with his niece, Catherine Barton, in a grand house in London, surrounded by the colour red drapes, furniture, cushions, a colour that perhaps reminded him of the alchemical stage of rubido, the reddening, the final step before the creation of the philosopher's stone. He held court like a monarch of the mind, and his word in the Royal Society was law. It was during these years of supreme authority that the old rivalries flared into their final, hottest burns. The ghost of Robert Hooke, the man who had dared to criticize Newton's early work on optics, still haunted him. When Hooke died, Newton took over the Royal Society and, it is whispered, oversaw the removal of Hooke's portrait, ensuring that the face of his rival would vanish from history. And then there was Leibniz, the German mathematician who had developed calculus independently, a feat that Newton viewed as a theft of his own intellectual property. The dispute over who discovered the mathematics of change became a war of letters and pamphlets, a conflict that spanned the continent. Newton, the master of the mint, used the same tactics against Leibniz that he had used against Chaloner. He packed the investigative committee with his own supporters, he wrote the report himself under a pseudonym, and he used his influence to crush the reputation of the German scholar. It was a display of dominance that was absolute and terrifying. He could not bear to share the throne of discovery. The universe was one, the truth was one, and he was its prophet. But as the years stretched on, the fire began to dim. The hair that had once been analyzed for mercury turned entirely white, a silver halo around a face etched with the gravity of 80 years. The majestic isolation returned, not of the plague years, but of old age. He spent less time at the mint and more time in his study. Surrounded by the dog-eared books of his library, he returned to the Bible, to the chronologies of ancient kingdoms, calculating the generations from Adam to the Apocalypse. He wrote millions of words that would remain largely unread for centuries, secret treatises on the nature of the Trinity and the corruption of the Church. He sat now, listening to the ticking of the clock, the pendulum swinging back and forth, slicing time into discrete, manageable units. The hanging tree was a distant memory, a necessary cruelty in a world of fallen men. He looked down at his hands, the skin akin to parchment, the veins like rivers on a map. He had held the universe in these hands. He had weighed the earth. He had touched the mind of God, The silence of the room was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against his chest. He was tired. The relentless drive to know, to uncover, to solve, had consumed him entirely. He had never married, never known the touch of a lover, never fathered a child. His children were his books, his laws, his gold coins, and his secrets. He was the last of the magicians, a bridge between the age of faith and the age of reason, and he was standing now at the far end of that bridge, looking back into the mist. He dipped the quill one last time, but the ink was running dry. The candle on his desk sputtered, the flame dancing in a draught that no one else could feel. It was time to lay down the burden of genius. It was time to surrender the need to organize the infinite and simply let it be. The heavy eyelids closed, and the great mind began to drift, floating away from the rigid geometry of the room, away from the tower and the mint and the hanging tree, drifting toward a vast, silent ocean where the laws of motion dissolved into the quiet, dark waters of the unknown.